Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a recent book by James Graham Wilson, America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nitze, and the National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan, published in July of this year by Cornell University Press. And our discussants this afternoon are Tom Schwartz of Vanderbilt University and Victoria Phillips, Global Fellow of the Wilson Center. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar along with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. As some of you know, the seminar was launched in 2010. It's been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. A few quick things before we get going. First, as always, we like to recognize a key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors makes these seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, this afternoon's session is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project. Third, please take note of our next session of the Washington Seminar. We reconvene 1 week from Thursday on November 14th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a discussion of Sheila Fitzpatrick's new book, Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons, and the Birth of the Cold War. Of course, we hope you can join us. On the logistics front, today's session is being recorded. It can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many, many dozens of past programs are archived. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, we can really get going, and I turn over the Zoom screen to my co-host, Christian Osterman. Christian.
Thank you, Eric. I'm delighted to welcome all of you as well this afternoon from Memphis, Tennessee. It gives me real pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our featured speaker, of course, who will start us off is James Graham Wilson, who received his PhD in diplomatic history from the University of Virginia in 2011. He is currently a supervisory historian at the Department of State and has compiled 10 volumes in the Foreign Relations of the United States Bruce series, really an essential service to the entire historical community. And James, we're all indebted to you and your colleagues for these important publications. He's published several of his own volumes. His first book was The Triumph of Improvisation, Gorbachev's Adaptability, Reagan's Engagement, and the End of the Cold War, published by Cornell University Press in 2014. And of course, earlier this year, he published America's Cold Warrior. Can you see it there? Yes. America's Cold Warrior, Paul Nitze, and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan, also published by Cornell University Press. James, it's wonderful to have you with us again at the Washington History Seminar, and the Zoom is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. And I'd like to make two quick acknowledgments. The first is that the views are my own and do not reflect those of the United States government. The second one is about this the seminar, and I need to point out that, or to say that about 10 years ago, I really got the idea for this book, being in a wonderful seminar led by, or that featured Frank Castigliola, who was working on the Kennan Diaries. And as he was talking about Kennan, what Kennan was thinking or writing or saying at different points of the Cold War, I was in the middle of working on the Foreign Relations volume covering nuclear arms control in the 1980s. And I kept thinking, well, yeah, Kennan said that, Kennan thought that, but I'm not sure it made much of a difference. And so I went out with Frank that night, and he encouraged me to sort of get into this project because I kept thinking, well, at those moments, Paul Nitze, I know, was participating. And so who was Paul Nitze? Well, he was a practitioner of U.S. national security who commanded White House attention from Franklin Roosevelt, at least until the Ronald Reagan era. And then I think became his legacy once again became important after September 11th, 2001. And I think it's important today as we think about Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, etc. When I say he commanded White House attention, he sometimes worked directly for the executive branch. Other times, he criticized heavily a sitting president in a manner that I argue in the book led to changes in policy. So he wasn't just sitting around, being critical for its own sake. I think he was successful multiple times in changing the policies. And I try to frame the book as starting out that Nitze and his family, Nitze then a boy, with his sister and his parents, they're climbing in the Alps in the summer of 1914, and they go up the mountain, and they're given milk from a cow from a kind of farm family, family of farmers, and they come down, and the same family is in tears because the father has just been mobilized, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and World War I is about to break out. And then I kind of bookend that with Nitze as an older man. In the fall of 2001, he's presiding over the School of Advanced International Studies that's named after him at that point. And he's about to host then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who's there to give a speech about the importance of missile defenses, a topic that was of great interest to Paul Nitze and his career. And of course, that day it became September 11th, and the meeting was postponed. But in those two kind of dates in time, 1914 to 2001, I try to make the case in the book that there's no other single American who is involved for as long at high levels in terms of shaping U.S. National security strategy and in practice. So what are the ways he did this? Well, as I think those of you who may know a bit about Paul Nitze, he made a good deal of money. Well, he thrived in the 1930s on Wall Street as an investment banker. And he took financial risks, and he had some good luck. But, the kind of financial success led him to get into government. It got him into kind of circles, James Forrestal being the most important kind of conduit for bringing him into the Franklin Roosevelt administration on the eve of the U.S. entry into World War II. But one of the things that he does that I think is very important is that he doesn't go back to his earlier career as the war ends in 1945. He stays on, and I try to make the case in the book that his having some form of financial independence allowed him to take greater risks in terms of the career path that he developed after 1945. Unlike a foreign service officer, he didn't have the next onward assignment. Unlike a colonel, he didn't try to become a general. He didn't really. There was no set track for somebody who is a generalist who is interested in national security writ large. That is to say, the protection of U.S. domestic core values against external threats. And he carved out this path. He's willing to sometimes be passed over for promotion, but he's also willing to kind of stand up and say that other people are wrong. And I think that's very important. It serves him well in terms of his kind of becoming a source of independent judgment on affairs of war and peace. So yeah, number one, he carves out this path, this career path that frankly the National Security Act, when it's set up, doesn't establish people who can work in different fields, who can grasp of economics, of strategic matters. Number two, he aspires to find a balance in what he calls tension between opposites. When he gives us a commencement speech for one of his sons, I think in 1952 or 53 or so, he goes on about this kind of this idea going back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus about finding tension, harmony between two opposite things. Now, this I'm sure was a lot to take in as at a high school graduation, but it's something that he fixates on, and you can see different versions of it. John Lewis Gaddis, he writes about similarly that you have to have two competing ideas in one's mind, but he may not have called that grand strategy, but he, I think, strove to become comfortable as somebody who could wrestle with very difficult matters at high levels and just try to balance two competing impulses. And then third, I try to make the point of the book that he gains a knowledge, an expertise about the role of nuclear weapons and foreign affairs that is a combination of reading about it, thinking about it, and also being in the room, especially if you think about plans post the start of the Korean War, where the United States, did think about the possibility of using nuclear weapons. And Paul Nitze, or then atomic weapons, but Paul Nitze, was intimately involved in these discussions. And through line to the end of his career, throughout his career, I try to say in the book that, he may not have gotten the same acclaim as Tom Schelling or Bernard Brodie or later Robert Jervis, but he sort of he knew as much as they did, and with that is to say, one also has to be very modest about what can ultimately know. And I think what he really believed strongly in was that the United States needed to preserve what he called the preponderance of power, and that is what had led Japan to attack at Pearl Harbor, that had led toward repetition in 1946, and that from his prism, his viewpoint, that it ultimately has what led the Soviets to back down during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in the second half of the book, I spent a lot of time writing about what I think became he sort of narrowed his aperture to focus almost exclusively on the nuclear balance and how to craft a regime of strategic stability that would disincentivize a potential first strike, but also make clear that, if there were ever a repetition of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there would be an outcome in the favor of the United States and his allies. And I could talk more about some of his ideas and the kind of Nitze scenario and his opposition to SALT II. But let me just sort of close by saying that I think one of the things that may be a little provocative in this book is that, NSC 68 is extremely important, and probably few things could be as important in the 2024 where we are right now. And I say this to mean that I think that, the combination of NSC 68 and Kennan's long telegrams and some of the other kind of foundational documents in U.S. early Cold War strategy is that they were able to integrate some of the aspirational foundation principles with challenges of the time, and ultimately lay the objective as we want to prevail without war. We want to win without war. And I think that's something we always have to keep track of, that these are ways of preventing major power war. But the thing that I think is a little bit provocative, on top of NSC 68, he will always be associated with NSC 68, but I make the case that he really is even more influential in terms of shaping policy, crafting policies during the middle part of the Ronald Reagan administration. First, in his kind of aspiration to find a middle ground in the so-called Euro missiles affair leading up to an INF treaty, but then also putting together what becomes the so-called Monday package of a kind of three-phased approach that greatly appeals to Ronald Reagan and which he presents to Mikhail Gorbachev. Three-phased approach that would ultimately seek to transform from a focus on strategic offensive forces to mutual defenses. And while we didn't sort of get the full consequences of that, the aspirational accomplishments, I think that Nitze was extremely important in getting the framework for what became the 1991 START 1 agreement that I think led to START 2, led to a mechanism for dealing with the potential loose nukes in the former Soviet Union, but at the very least kind of was able to capture and modestly reduce the most destabilizing Soviet forces. So even though he kind of ends his career, he's tries to stay on in 1999 under the George H.W. Bush administration, and Jim Baker, my understanding, tells him, you can stay in the building, we'll still pay you, but we're really not that interested in hearing what you have to say, whereas Nitze had been very close to George Shultz. So Nitze kind of goes back and sulks and leaves government for the last time in the spring of 1991. But it's a pretty incredible tenure from roughly 1940 to 1991. He never leaves DC, and I write in the last chapter that it didn't stop him from continuing to write and editorialize and write various pieces about what the United States should be doing in the post-Cold War era, and among those things should be focusing on global climate change as a threat to the U.S. national security by the late 1990s.
Great, thank you, James, for this overview. There's a lot here to unpack. You sort of skipped from 1950 right through into the midst of the Reagan administration. A lot of ground to cover. We have two terrific colleagues, terrific historians to help us, pull some of these stories out of on the table here. We'll start with Professor Thomas Allen Schwartz, a historian of foreign relations of the United States, one of the leading historians of diplomatic history with related interests in American politics, the history of international relations, modern European history, and biography. His most recent book is Henry Kissinger and American Power, a political biography, published in 2020. Early in his career, he was the author of America's Germany, John J. McCloy in the Federal Republic of Germany, Harvard, 1991, translated into German as Die Atlantikbrücke, and which was the book that received the Stuart Burnouf Book Prize of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations and the Harry Truman Book Award, given by the Truman Presidential Library. He's also the author of Lyndon Johnson and Europe in the Shadow of Vietnam, published by Harvard in 2003, which examined the Johnson administration's policy towards Europe and assessed the impact of the war in Vietnam on its other foreign policy objectives. He is co-editor with Matthias Schulz of The Strained Alliance, U.S.-European Relations from Nixon to Carter, published by Cambridge in 2009, and we're glad and delighted to welcome him back as a former Wilson Center Fellow and as a member of the History and Public Policy Programs Advisory Board. Tom, good to have you back. Welcome back to the Washington History Seminar. Zoom room is all yours.
Well, thank you, Christian. I am really honored to be here. I misread the original invitation and sort of had to dismiss my students early today. Before I did, I asked them if they had ever heard of Paul Nitze. And I'm afraid, James, they have not. And that probably is not necessarily a commentary on Nitze as much as, just the fact that he is not as household name. Not that they probably would have heard of Kennan or Kissinger, but maybe some of them might have. But he doesn't. And yet he is, I think you make a very, very powerful case for his importance in the Cold War. This is a figure who really had a career in national security, but a very consequential career in national security. Someone who really was involved intensively in some of the biggest and some of the most important issues that the United States faced over almost half century. So again, I also had the privilege of reading this book early on in its galleys and the rest, and just very impressed with what you've done. Um, Nitze, of course, also now, I think what's now happening as we enter from the sort of the terrorism era, the global war on terrorism, now to the great power competition. We are rethinking, of course, nuclear weapons issues. This has become a major question of as China has modernized, the nuclear threats that Vladimir Putin made to Ukraine. So many of the things that Paul Nitze discussed and worked on have now re-entered into the discussions on national security. And I think he is very relevant. His career and the topics and issues that you raise are very relevant to it. And you write in a excellent, readable style, which is wonderful. It's not bogged down by either excessive jargon, which of course used to be one of the paralyzing things about any writing on nuclear weapons. The acronyms there outnumbered every other type of discourse in national security. It could drive one crazy in trying to keep that straight. And you do a great job, I think, of writing clearly about very controversial, difficult subjects over the time Nitze worked. So I did want to just offer that as praise, and then turn to some questions about the book. And Christian, please do cut me off at some point when we get to that point on questions, because I could go on a lot on these. The first one I want to ask you about, actually, though, stems from the fact that my mentor, Ernest May, was a great fan of Paul Nitze. And when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, he would frequently talk about his conversations with Nitze at times, and then Nitze in the 90s as well. He had contact with him. And he would write the book, American Cold War Strategy, Interpreting NSC 68, which I have used in my classes and the rest. And whenever I teach NSC 68, it usually is in the context of a course on the Cold War, where students begin with George Kennan's long telegram, look at his X article, and then jump ahead to Paul Nitze's NSC 68. And oftentimes they engage their critical thinking and wonder, how in the world did we get to NSC 68 from what Kennan is saying? And they often write these critical commentaries on Nitze's exaggeration of the Soviet threat and these issues that seem to drive NSC 68. In particular, and this is a question both of asking a little bit, did Nitze, we learned a lot about Soviet foreign policy at the end of the Cold War, after the Cold War ended, and we've had such great books by fellow Wilson fellows like Vlad Zubak and others on Soviet foreign policy. And we know in some ways that some of the things that are in NSC 68 are clearly stretching the concept of truth about Soviet policy. Did Nitze did he go through a period of rethinking any of his earlier ideas, or did he, just to ask, was he subject to sort of refutation from history later?
Let me answer that in a way. Well, first, thank you so much for your kind words. Let me try to tie two of the issues together here. Whether Nitze went through a period of rethinking or revisiting his earlier assumptions, and the matter of nuclear weapons? The answer to the first one is no. He, from the best I can tell, never revisited things he said early on based on potentially new evidence. I think it's important to the names you offered earlier on, particularly Kissinger and Kennan. But let's take Kennan for instance. I think one of the reasons why Kennan received such acclaim is that he wrote so eloquently. I mean, that's the main thing. He's such a good writer. But then in what he wrote, it was, sometimes a sense of regret, but sometimes he regretted that other people misinterpreted what he wrote. But the bottom line is that Nitze regretted nothing. The reason why I think it's important to kind of tie it together to his stance on nuclear weapons after the Cold War. So Nitze came out in the late 90s saying we should abolish nuclear weapons. He kind of joined a number of growing chorus that they were no longer necessary. But his point was that the precision guided munitions that he read about in the Persian Gulf War, the Balkans, etc., that they had made nuclear weapons superfluous. It wasn't that he regretted, anything that he called for earlier on. So that's I think important in terms of like thinking about Nitze today, and because some people may say, well, he was against nuclear weapons. He kind of repented at the end, and I don't think that adequately captures him. And I think a lot of the things that he was saying in the late 90s, if for instance he was also against NATO expansion, whatever one thinks of that, whatever one thinks of that, I think it's difficult to kind of insert what he and others wrote and said at the end of their life with the present situation in 2024. If I could say one more quick thing about NSC 68, I try to make this point in the book that it relates also to Kennan, that, in early 1946, Nitze is working on the Pacific War portion of the Strategic Bombing Survey. And he's, I think, he's laying out, he took on the question of like, why did the Japanese attack the US in the first place? Truman had asked him to do it, but he really took it and ran with it. And I think he's writing that very much thinking about what's going on with the Soviet Union, particularly after with Stalin's so-called election speech. And that's very much sort of on his mind while he's writing it. And so when he then prepares it and tries to tell people about it, Dean Acheson and others are like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. This is also not very well written. And then he's very furious. He's very frustrated when then George Kennan writes his long telegram, which his own, former mentor, Jim Forrestal, is telling everyone in town to read. I do think that so at that point, his frustration is that, well, first of all, his frustration is that people like Kennan's writing better than his. But there's a substantive difference, which is that Nitze, who had been involved with the procuring critical minerals during World War II and sort of gallivanting around the jungles in South America at one point, that he views this as global from the start, that we can't just pick and choose certain points of the globe to try to resist Soviet penetration. We need to view this as global from the start. And sort of that's what you get with NSC 68. Is it occasionally hyperbolic in tone? Yes, it is. I mean, but there was a clear, as I think those who have studied the Cold War carefully are aware that the then Secretary of Defense in late 1949, Louis Johnson, had promised Truman to cap the defense budget at about $13 billion, and Nitze and others had a very clear ask, a rationale with NSC 68, which is to get him to raise it as much as possible, hopefully to triple it. And then ultimately it took the Korean War for Truman to do that. But so I just, these numbers probably are hard to comprehend for an 18-year-old at Vanderbilt College, but back then there was a moral responsibility to the president felt a moral responsibility to balance the budget, and what they were asking for was something that was going to not balance the budget, and you needed to make a really hard case in order to get the president to do that.
Just to follow up,
Yeah.
Ernest May used to present the workings of NSC 68, and particularly Nitze and Atchison's work, as almost like a conspiracy among a certain number of people. And I noticed in your work, you focus on how the tactical elements that went into convincing the president, or at least creating the situation such that they could sell such a policy. I'm wondering if you think the type of bureaucratic maneuvering that Nitze was involved in to get NSC 68 approved is something that could happen today with a national security policy, or was it unique to that moment?
Well, the thing that's sort of incredible to read this now is that Nitze, as the the director of policy planning in the State Department, was convening meetings that included the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. And now, I think the thing that's superseded a lot of that is since 1950, the kind of the rise and consolidation of the national security staff. It's called NSC 68, as some people know, just because it's the 68th paper, and it was outsourced then, and it was a natural thing to do to outsource it to policy planning staff. But that would be very hard to do that sort of from outside the National Security Council. However, I think that kind of the ingenuity and innovation of policy entrepreneurialism is very much alive, and it's actually, you can see it from his subsequent years. I try to make the case, for instance, in the book on Eisenhower, that he's in a very kind of peculiar role during the Eisenhower administration. He's there for a few months. He's offered a job that is later rescinded. But then when he's kind of setting up shop at SICE, he's a CIA contractor, which means that they hold his security clearance. He can use to hold a kind of nuclear clearance, and that this allows him to be, to participate in all these kind of, weekend seminars. I mean, just things with what to do about the hardest matters. And, John Foster Dulles they don't like each other, but he calls him in because he needs the sounding board, somebody that knows these issues. So he's sort of, on one hand, still has a foot in government, and he uses that to kind of, and I don't mean this in a conspiratorial, pernicious way. He uses that to really influence policy, and I do think that that's still possible now. It's more difficult, I think, if you're an assistant secretary level in a particular bureau of the government that's not the National Security Council, because it has such a formidable staff and such a powerful national security advisor now.
I'd like to jump ahead and just ask you a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have the advantage, or at least have the opportunity to listen to the tapes and then compare that. Nitze, I guess, kept also extraordinary records of his involvements during that time. Did he have second thoughts about his advocacy and arguments during that time? And I wonder if you might comment a little bit about his relationship to President Kennedy.
Well, as you have listened to the tapes of it, I think some others on the call have listened to the tapes, and one of the things that's so extraordinary is just how polite President Kennedy was to everyone during this incredibly stressful time. With, I would say, the exception of Paul Nitze, I think it's one of the few times that Kennedy sort of loses his cool. And that's, they never really hit it off. Talking about the position of National Security Advisor, Kennedy had originally offered it to him, and Nitze didn't seize on it because he didn't think it was that important. Just kind of a mistake. But Nitze was not that impressed. So I'm basing this a lot of this off of these series of these wonderful interviews that Nitze did for his own memoir, and it ran from about 1982 to 1989. And he worked with Steve Reardon and Ann Smith, and they're at the Library of Congress. And so there's a lot of granularity and color there that's not necessarily in the memoir itself, but his kind of recollections from the early days of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that Kennedy didn't know what to do, and it was only when Atchison came in, when they brought him in, that there was a kind of clear figure of command. And the takeaway from it that, and I'm not saying this is necessarily right, I necessarily agree with it, but Nitze's takeaway was that if you had somebody like Harry Truman from the start, you would have had kind of clear and decisive action. Now, it was clear and decisive action, what we needed to have happen at the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm not sure. I'm awfully kind of enamored. Well, I mean, you mentioned Marty Sherman, I think at some point, or maybe it was before the call, but I mean, there's a really interesting, theme he writes in his own book about the late Marty Sherman, about the role of kind of Adlai Stevenson and kind of nudging Kennedy, whether he liked it or not, to kind of look for a diplomatic solution. And Nitze would be horrified at that. He just said, well, the Soviets backed down because the U.S. had conventional and nuclear superiority, and we can't allow that to erode. Now, as the Soviet diplomat famously tells, I think it was John McCloy, after it, you're never going to do this to us, and he wasn't kidding. So latter half of the book is about what happens when America loses its preponderance because of the Soviets' attempts to make sure that this never happened again after October 1962.
Yes, it is the discussion with McCloy that always fascinated me, that the Soviets were sort of clear that they were going to build up, and that actually does bring up a question, and this is a little bit of special interest pleading, but the relationship with Henry Kissinger and détente and Nitze's role during those years in particular. And I'm particularly interested, you're careful in this, but of Nitze's campaign against Kissinger through Elmo Zumwalt and some of the efforts that Nitze was doing to in a sense, go after Kissinger's détente policy. And I'm wondering, do you think there might be a connection there to Kissinger's decision, as we were talking even earlier about the declassification of NSC-68 in 1975, that rivalry or that political attack from Nitze and Zumwalt and others on détente, and particularly on the efforts of Kissinger and Ford to get a SALT II agreement, and Nixon, of course, to get a SALT II agreement.
Let me deal with that in parts. The first thing is the relationship, the frenemyship, as I think I used the word, with Nitze and Kissinger, that in sometime in the 1950s, Paul Nitze, who considers himself a kind of leading strategist on nuclear matters, and somebody comes along that does basically all of the things that Nitze does and does it better, and that's Henry Kissinger, especially with respect to the writing. And they work together on a Council on Foreign Relations project. Kissinger is the rapporteur for this project, and from Nitze's perspective, Kissinger assembles papers that others have done and puts it out as his own book on nuclear weapons. Nitze initially sits down and writes a scathing review of this book and points out many factual errors. And when he submits it, I think, to Foreign Affairs, he gets a letter back saying that Kissinger is threatening to sue him. Now, Nitze tones down his review, but there's a story here that I think is very evocative of what follows, and that is the next time Nitze encounters Kissinger personally, Kissinger comes up to him and said, part of the agreement, and I won't do the voice here, but you can hear the voice, right? That Kissinger says, I was going to write a response to your review, and I got to page 140 of the response, and I decided it wasn't worth it. So there, Kissinger has this ability to sort of diffuse the situation, and Nitze doesn't know really how to respond. He didn't have that capability. I mean, Kissinger could have written 140 pages. Nitze couldn't have done that. Less admirably, perhaps, you can hear in the tapes with Kissinger and Nixon that the kind of willingness to flatter and to kiss up. Nitze didn't have that either. Yes, I cover. So Nitze leaves. I think, goodness, 73 or 74, and as you say, the kind of rivalry between Zumwalt and Nitze. So Nitze had worked with Zumwalt when Nitze was Secretary of the Navy in the 60s, and they were professionally and personally close. And there's a kind of campaign against Kissinger. Zumwalt and others are speaking ill of détente, and I think Kissinger even brings it up with the Chinese or something. Zumwalt is out to get me. I don't know, and my colleagues, I've pestered them on this, that we have no kind of authoritative answer for why Kissinger declassified NSC 68 in 1975. It was a few months in advance of the Foreign Relations volume that would have declassified it. Anyway, I think it appeared in the U.S. Naval War College in-house publication. But I don't, it's also hard to say, well, what would it have achieved? I'm not entirely sure. But I think that, the declassification of it, though, it is kind of an important landmark in terms of the kind of political history of the mid to late 1970s, in the sense that, and I say this in the book, that, Ronald Reagan and others appeal to disaffected Democrats who say, look, the Truman people, actually were quite tough, and the Democratic Party has been fractured by McGovernism of 1972, and Reagan says, I was one of these people who supported Truman, and now you can see NSC 68 for what it stood for, which is America's first principles of the United States. And so there was a kind of mutual attraction then between Nitze and Reagan, and both benefit from it.
I have one more question, Christian.
Yeah, one more maybe, then we'll bring in Victoria.
Okay, I want to ask you, if you could, and I think this is a real contribution of your book, how would you, what role do you see your book playing in revising some of the narrative of the 1980s in terms of Ronald Reagan, Nitze's role in encouraging and bringing about some of the arms control agreements of that time?
That's a great, very important question. I think that I think it shows that Reagan was flexible and pragmatic in terms of seeking arms agreements with the Soviets. We think of the Walk in the Woods affair in the summer of 1982, when Nitze really went beyond his instructions and discussed with the Soviet interlocutor the idea of something less than 0-0 intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. And I think Reagan actually, it wasn't until January of '83 that when this broke that it became a bit of a scandal, but Reagan didn't reject it out of hand. Ultimately, the Soviets were the first to reject it, and that kind of settled the matter. And I don't mean to say that, this was just, Reagan needed these people to put ideas in his head. Because in 1985, certainly it was Reagan's ambition to have a vast reductions in the most destabilizing nuclear weapons. But he needed, the kind of procedural framework that I think that Nitze, and assisted by Jim Timby put forward in this so-called Monday package. So it's not taking anything away from Reagan. I think there was a kind of meeting of the minds, and from Nitze's perspective, Reagan and Harry Truman were sort of two sides of the same coin.
Okay.
Thank you.
We want to. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom, for your thoughtful questions. Before I introduce our colleague Victoria Phillips, let me remind our viewers that you can join. We hope you will join the conversation. You can do so in two ways. Our preferred way is to bring you into the conversation directly, at least via audio. And you can do so by using the raise hand function in the Zoom, and you'll get queued and I will call on you. Or you can use the Q&A function and post your question to the whiteboard, and we'll see if we can get to these questions, and I will put them to our panelists. All right, it now gives me really great pleasure to introduce another terrific colleague, Professor Victoria Phillips, who's the author of Martha Graham's Cold War, The Dance of American Diplomacy, published by Oxford in 2020, which explores the political life of modern dancer Martha Graham to promote the United States in over 30 nations for every presidential administration from Eisenhower to Bush. At present, she is a global fellow with the Wilson Center at Wolfson College and at the Oxford University Center for Life Writing, where she will be working on her next book under contract, a biography of Eleanor Lansing Dulles. While at Columbia University's European Institute, she developed and ran the Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty Fellowship, which became the Cold War Archival Research Fellowship CWAR, now run out of the Wilson Center, and Victoria playing a key role in this. She taught Cold War culture at Columbia and was as a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. She received the 2021 University Award for Innovation in Teaching. She co-directs the Cold War Archival Research Institute, as well as the History, Culture, and Diplomacy Project at the LSE and History Online. She's the chair of the Digital Resources and Archival Sharing platform for the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. She's co-founder of the Global Biography Working Group, GlobeBio, and serves on the Gilda Lehrman Institute of American History's board, the board of the European Institute at Columbia University, and the National Advisory Board of the National Cold War Center in Blytheville, Arkansas. And let me just say, this is just a tiny fraction of her long career. With that, Victoria, over to you. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar, and the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you for the introduction. Some things have changed, but some things are the same, and it's always an honor to work with Wilson. James, thank you for this wonderful book. I want to reiterate what Thomas said about its import and about the wonderful writing that is accessible. And I could easily see shifting my syllabus for next semester at the CUNY Graduate Center and assigning it to non-policy people. So thank you so much for that. I loved the Beau-Liar trope and the idea of tension, but also I thought what you brought with that was this idea of precision, which seemed to be an important factor. So I approach this a little differently. I loved that on page 2, you said, this is a political biography, boom, right? That this is what I'm doing. And in that, the expectation is that certain things are going to be cut out. And I found that as well with the book on Martha Graham. Some things that were in the personal realm, luckily, could be left out. However, as I go back through that, I'm wondering, particularly here, I'm wondering a couple of things with that excellent definition, but also maybe considering what would happen if it were expanded slightly. As everyone knows my work, of course, the two questions I'm going to ask are where are the women, and where's culture, and kind of where are the friends? I was so impressed by the consistent trip ups that Nitze had in one-on-one conversations with people, this very strong personality that he had. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. But when it came to the women, and the relationships, I was fascinated by his wife, and his wife's mother, his second wife, who was obviously quite accomplished. So here's a man who has these very accomplished women around him. Yet, on the other hand, there is no mention of two very strong women who definitely interacted with him, Dorothy Fosdick and probably Eleanor Dulles. I'm wondering, if is that something that you came across? Is it not something that you came across? How did you make these decisions about what to include and what not to include when it came to the personal as political?
Thank you so much, Victoria. I think to the last question, did I come across them? And so Dorothy Fosdick, had worked for him on policy planning staff, and then later worked, I believe, for Henry Scoop Jackson, whom Paul Nitze wanted to be president in 1976. I honestly, in what I find, the people that he writes about or he speaks about in his memoir, it is male centric. It is just simply male centric, and I don't sort of, I know that he later on was very fond of Roz Ridgway. In later on, the period that I know the best, had the most experience with, the sort of second Reagan administration. But I just don't know how to square the circle in terms of the political portion of it, in terms of his personal relationship. So I should step back and say that I did think of this at the start as a full scale, 800 or 900 page biography, and I do leave a lot on the table, and there is room for somebody to write that book. I found him very difficult to kind of penetrate in terms of the inner life. And I'll give you an example, and that is, he doesn't, in 1985, when we restart the nuclear and space arms talks in Geneva, one of the reasons he doesn't go to become the U.S. Overall head of delegation is because his wife is ill, and she dies. A couple months. I think it actually may have been the spring of 1986. But I find I go through his papers, and I both in kind of, I can say, working on some of the foreign relations volumes, but going through these interviews that are occurring every 2 or 3 weeks, I find absolutely no reference to the fact that his wife is sort of mortally ill and then died. I just, it's absent. And so this is one of the things, I confess that I didn't sort of know how to deal with that. And maybe still at some point we'll figure it out. But I just find him so compartmentalized in terms of the records that I find. Now, should I have done more, taken that as a variable and kind of, made that a theme of the book? I think that's a very fair criticism. I could have done that. I kind of tried to preempt it by just cutting it off, that I sort of can't get into this man's, I can't penetrate this man. I haven't found, I'll look again, but I've not found Eleanor Lansing Dulles. He had such a weird relationship with Foster that it's and some of you have read the book. Well, there's no reason to know it, but I mean, he actually writes a letter to John Foster Dulles telling him he should resign. I think in 1957, or he said you could find somebody else to do your job better. But Foster kept calling him in because there were so very few people that you could talk about these things with now. Now it's different. Now it's there are so many people in think tanks around government now who have served in government and may have active security clearances that there's kind of a greater population to draw on. But in the early 1950s, mid 1950s, it was a much different situation. I think the other thing is Nitze as a family man, for Nitze and his family, and you also think about sort of why are you doing this? Are you doing it for your kids? Are you doing it to have your kids to have a brighter future? And I also just find that totally find him impenetrable from my experience. He must have been an absent dad, as nearly everyone in the Cold War was. And I say this to friends, not that I have friends in high places, but I try to say to people that I encounter who are in government, I said, like, look, you probably hear about these stories about Kennan and Kissinger, et cetera. But you have to keep in mind that these people, or Jim Baker in 1980, when he's running the campaign and his family's in Houston and he's going to all these parties, networking, not that type of party, but I mean, just you got to understand these people we venerate as in the Cold War. They were all pretty lousy dads, and I'm sure their kids would rather have been with them. But I think I do feel a kind of pinch of regret that I didn't try more to organize my thoughts on this and try to kind of portray them honestly and systematically about how this is just somebody who is very hard to penetrate.
Well, I thought it was brilliant that you said, I'm not doing this.
I'm not doing this.
So
Yeah,
that was just, completely brilliant, but it did make me curious.
Yeah.
In terms of the cultural question, again, I think you were very clear, that he appreciated what you called high culture, and that's really not a part of this story. But what did fascinate me was the cultural idea of the American way of life that seems to infuse the book, an NS-68, and I was that he quoted the foundational documents of the United States makes perfect sense. But it also is, to me, a consistent way not to be specific. So, one of what is the American way of life? What do we mean by the American way of life? I had a class in Hungary, and a student said, well, what is it? That's a great question, right? What do we mean? And certainly in the earlier 50s and in the Cold War, it meant welfare and humanitarian relief in foreign countries, which it obviously did not mean to him, from your book. So I'm wondering if you were very clear in the book and wonderful in using this refrain of the American way of life. And I'm wondering if that shifted for him over time, or did he think about it? Did he write about it? What did he mean? Or was it a vehicle to get his policies enacted?
Yeah, I think that, so one thing I should say up front is that I find him, also not particularly interested in domestic affairs. Like, to give 1968 as an example, he seems really quite aloof to what's going on in the country. Within the country, he's focused so much on being, as he's Deputy Secretary of Defense. He, I think is kind of nominally supportive of, civil rights, for instance, but he has no real passion for really anything that's going on. So focused then from 69 onward on the nuclear balance. in terms of what it is we're defending, I think that to him, I go back to the way he describes what he did in the 1930s, that the kind of there was a kind of glorious recklessness that he participated in, but it was kind of freedom to him, that all of these bizarre business deals that he tried to create a kind of competitor to soda. Basically, it was like a soda stream. Ventures that failed, some that succeeded, helping to purchasing the land around Aspen. There was a sense that there was freedom to do this, and he was not somebody who kind of was. He was, the doors were never closed to him, so it's not like he kind of pulled himself up by his bootstraps. But that didn't mean he didn't work very hard, and he didn't get everything just because he was a white male. But I think that he had kind of maybe an impression early on in his 20s and 30s that then lasted without critical reflection in terms of his career in policy. But it was the American way of life. I think also to spotlight it on the globe, I think for him was kind of the ability to act, to avoid having to self-deter ourselves in the support of those areas we think that our ideals and interests can converge. That to him was the kind of the worst thing that could happen, that we would have to tie our hands behind our back. But that's sort of, I think, his explanation of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that, and well, later on after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after the Soviets kind of build up, is that there was a basic difference between the United States and its leadership and the Soviet Union, in that if there was ever a nuclear crisis again, the Soviets would have the capability of taking out our land-based missiles, and they could then say to the American president, we've withheld attack from your cities, and you face the choice of attacking us now, but we will then retaliate against your cities. So it's basically surrender or die. And I think that for Nitze, the American way of life in that situation was that no president would ever accept that deal. Of course, he would surrender. I mean, the president would not sacrifice millions of Americans. And so, how do you protect the American way of life that kind of elects a president like that? Well, you have to make sure that you kind of deter the adversary from ever putting you in that sort of position. But if you don't have sufficient strength, then the Soviet leaders will know, Americans will back down in this crisis. So I do think it's kind of implicitly, even if just implicitly, it's really tied to his kind of what he becomes known as the scenario in the 1970s. But he never really, Kennan, from his point, feels fairly alienated by modern American life. But Nitze, I just think, is silent upon it.
I could talk to you forever. Having been a former hedge fund manager, I'm fascinated by that aspect of his life and these crazy deals versus the Chicago model that sees everybody as rational. But in order to, I think, further engage the younger people in the audience, I'll skip that in favor of saying climate change. I was fascinated by that. So can you talk more about that?
About what? I'm sorry.
Climate change.
Oh, climate change. So I think it was his kind of deciding that nuclear weapons were now obsolete because of advanced conventional capabilities, and which he read about, with the Balkans and the Persian Gulf War. And he certainly was always I would say, a naturalist, and he looked for, he was somebody in search of like, what is the big thing on the horizon, the big existential threat. And, back in the mid 90s, and we encountered this as we start working in the office on the George H.W. Bush administration. And it's certainly not a dirty word at all for the Republican Party to think about climate change and as a, something good stewardship. But Nitze, who had no interest in kind of great disdain for politics, had no problem coming out and saying in the late 90s that this is the big thing on the horizon, even when the Democratic Party, most notably Al Gore, kind of hesitated to say it. But Nitze wanted to think about what's the most important danger out there, and I think that he said climate change in the late 90s for then a decade and a half after 9/11. We all would say terrorism, but I think he would be. I do think that he would say today that nothing has gotten less deadly, but the thing we have to worry the most about are these scenarios in, let's say, the South China Sea or with Taiwan. That to him, there's the element that the U.S. will be restrained, and we have to prevent that from happening. Kind of type of the Nitze scenario where we wouldn't, we would be deterred instead of deterring China from doing something. So I would say that he not that he would like lose his passion in thinking about global climate change, but the fact of the matter is that the kind of brute geopolitical variables in the equation that he encountered earlier in the Cold War, I think I would say would surpass that were he alive today.
Thank you, Victoria. Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll open it up to the audience.
I'll leave it to the audience. Thank you so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Victoria, for these marvelous questions. Let me just reiterate to join us in this conversation, ideally by using the raise hand function, and you'll be queued. Great. I'll see some folks have just responded. So let's call on, our first three audience members all are Steve's. Let's call on Steve Shore for the first question. Steve, a short question, please.
Yes. Did he want to become Secretary of State? And if so, why wasn't the position ever offered to him?
Can I answer that?
Go ahead, please. Yes.
Yeah. So he I'm pretty sure wanted to be he would have accepted Secretary of State if Kennedy had offered him. But I think the closest he came was Secretary of Defense in the run up to the 1976 election, and he expected to be Secretary of Defense in a Democratic administration. He in the summer of 1976 had a terrible meeting with Jimmy Carter in which he basically everyone around Carter said that they agreed with what he was saying, and Nitze said, "I don't agree with anything that these people have said." And you can kind of go from that moment to January of 1977, when nearly everyone else in the room with Carter in Georgia is part of his administration.
Thank you. You call on Steve Brady. Steve, if you could please unmute yourself. All right.
Thanks so much. Great conversation, and on a topic that is really fascinating to me. So that's going to be my kind of meta question, turning Tom's beginning on its head. His students, even at a great place like Vanderbilt, didn't know Nitze, hadn't heard of him. So my question, those of us who do this for a living, all of us would know who Nitze was, but there hasn't been a book like yours written yet, and the documentation out there is voluminous. It's certainly a lot of work, but it was doable. So I just kind of wanted to ask, why not? Why do you think yours is the first study of its kind? Why has no one delved into this fellow whose adult life was in the Cold War? and I have theories, and every time I think about it, a new theory pops up. So I just wanted to know why you thought that you were in this way able to go first.
Well, it would be unfair, I guess, to say that I went first. There were a number of, I think, very good book, a handful. Mr. Callahan, David Callahan. There's the sequence of books that Strobe Talbot did. Um, there is a wonderful dual biography by Nicholas Thompson of Ken and Nitze. There, as I said earlier, I mean, there remains to be written a really big kind of 800-page a book about him that kind of somebody more mature than myself can could get into the inner life. But the simple question, the simple answer to your question, I mean, so there should be, in my opinion, there should be nine or 10 books, and I think it's a topic that's sort of unlikely, to get somebody tenure. And I'm kind of I'm extremely fortunate in that regard that it's kind of, I don't have to worry about that. But it doesn't really fit in with the type of books people are writing in academia. And in terms of a popular history, there's so much wonderful, material. It's unending material in terms of Henry Kissinger. And I do think that Tom's book is the best out there, and I tell people that. But there will continue to be books that are widely read. But I think that, in general, there should be more books about the Cold War, that it's so important. So, clusters of elements, just are exactly what's going on now. And it just hasn't been, I think, a sufficient focus in American kind of popular imagination, but there's no avoiding it now.
Thank you. We lost one of our Steves, so Svetlana Savronskaya is next. Svetlana.
Thank you very much for taking my question. I am fascinated by the biography of Nitze. Thank you, James, for writing it. I did not have a chance to read it yet, so I'm definitely going. My question is, when do you think Nitze started to believe, if he ever started to believe? I kind of looks from the documents that he did in Gorbachev's intentions, in the sincerity of his intentions to end the Cold War and end the arms race, and especially get rid of nuclear weapons. Do you think there is any particular moment, maybe Reykjavik, maybe later, maybe never, when Nitze said, well, these guys are for real and we really need to work with them? Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana.
Thank you, Sveta. So I don't think that Nitze believed that. I think he was skeptical of Gorbachev, and he was not. I'll say I don't think he was entranced by Gorbachev at Reykjavik, but I have to also say that he spent the whole night in the meeting with Akhmayev, and so I mean, like literally overnight. So I don't actually know how much kind of he saw him, or there was but even though there was a real breakthrough in that overnight meeting in terms of this, to the point Tom mentioned earlier, this obscure kind of acronym of the SRAMs on B-52s, there was a breakthrough in that meeting, but I don't think that Nitze saw much of Gorbachev. But here's the evocative answer I'll give. I mean, that 2 weeks before the wall comes down, Nitze's at the Miller Center in University of Virginia. This is the fall of 1989. And somebody asks him point blank, do you think Gorbachev would ever let Eastern Europe go? And he gives a paragraph answer saying, no, those things will never happen. So, I mean, you have your evidence for what happened. But backing up a little bit, I mean, he's extremely gloomy. In 1987, there's a meeting for the 50th anniversary of the policy planning staff. where all of their surviving members are, all the surviving directors are there. They're all still alive. None of them, they all sort of refuse to die. But Nitze goes on and on about how the U.S. is dealing from a position of weakness and how Gorbachev is this dynamic figure who's out to exploit U.S. In this period because he's so popular. And so that even though Nitze tries very hard in 1988 to get a START agreement, he is not, I would not say he's a fan of Gorbachev. He thinks that he can just keep hammering it out based on the merits and based on the very real, counting formula that they did get in December of 1987. And I don't find, to reiterate another point earlier, I don't find him kind of revisiting later on his initial skepticism of Gorbachev. He never comes out and says, well, I sure got that guy wrong.
Thank you. Let me call on Mike McCracken next. Mike, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I was a climate change scientist at Lawrence Livermore from the 60s to the 90s.
Wow.
And there were a number of environmental issues that came up during that time about nuclear war, whether it was radioactivity in the 60s or stratospheric ozone depletion from large weapons in the 70s or smoke in the, a nuclear winter in the 80s. I don't see any indication in the book. I didn't find it that he considered any of these sort of indirect consequences, perhaps, of nuclear war as important or something to consider as opposed to, I guess, the direct destruction he saw when he visited Hiroshima. Is that right?
I've not seen that. And but I also, one of the things that strikes me about Nitze in the late 60s and 70s is that he's not so involved in kind of policies working on nuclear effects, and it's kind of more, how do we structure our forces, how do we get Congress to support that, and how do we then use that to leverage getting reductions in large Soviet missiles. So even though there are people, I know that there are people working on these topics during this period, I think it's not in Nitze's direct focus, and I'm not sure that his kind of thinking about global climate change in the late 90s as a threat is a direct consequence of his kind of being exposed to matters of nuclear effects earlier on.
Thank you. Let me call on Thomas Simmons. Thomas?
I'm silent.
James. Yeah, hi.
Well,
Hey.
I haven't read it yet either, but it's a great
Hi,
book.
Ambassador. Thank you.
Yeah, we know each other. I knew Nitze in the 80s as a sort of a junior colleague. My question for you is whether you have any sense that for him, the 60s broke some spring in the American way of life that made us more vulnerable. It sounds as if he hadn't changed much since he was a young man and didn't interpret what was going on in the country in the same alarmed way that Kennan did. But I'm just asking the question because the next generation actually did get that feeling that something bad had happened to America, and that it was more vulnerable even than it had been before. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Simons, and thank you for your wonderful generosity to me over the years. I don't get the impression that he thought that something had broken in the American way of life. I think that, I think about him in the 1980s and 1982 and 83 with the concern about kind of protest movements and Western Europe, then that was going to derail INF deployment, and this would kind of lead to the end of NATO. And that's kind of through line from his reluctance to take the Jupiters out of Turkey, because he thought that once you start doing that, the whole alliance will fall apart. So it was a kind of fracturing, societal fracturing was sort of in his mind just a kind of something to be incorporated into his logic chain, as he called it, for how do you make shrewd policy. But I don't think it really had any emotional wallop to him. His kids would attend and observe some of the demonstrations in the late 1960s, but they would report back to him. But I just, again, maybe it's because he was so impenetrable. Maybe I was, unable to kind of get into his head. But I just don't get a sense that he steps back and is saying, I see a fractured America. There's another explanation here, which is that, he became very insulated, setting up shop in DC, and that is a real, phenomenon. And I think anyone who's, gone through the last 10 years of American politics can say that it is very possible to kind of get within the beltway, so to speak, and not have a sense of what's going on in the country. But even then, I'm not sure it would have really shaped his recommendations one way or the other. He wanted to weigh in on matters of war and peace, the kind of high politics, and he thought that he was every logic could be applied to every equation, and that he had the confidence to argue and to take risks. So I'm not sure it would have fundamentally altered, what he proposed.
Thank you. Stephen Schwartz, you're back. Please unmute.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. I prematurely lowered my hand. You touched on this very briefly earlier, but I was wondering if you could address Nitze's October 1999 op-ed calling for the unilateral elimination of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, which happened 25 years ago last Monday. I had a fairly well-known national security journalist tell me when I shared this online that Nitze was essentially not in his right mind and didn't know what he had signed his name to. And yet that op-ed builds on arguments that he made in an op-ed almost 5 years earlier in 1994 in the Washington Post, when he said that conventional weapons could ultimately replace nuclear weapons. Then he went all the way in 99 and said they could. We didn't need them anymore. They'd be useless. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, so I think I agree with the gist of what you're saying, which is that it was a evolution over 7 or 8 years, and that can be clearly documented. And I think it was not at all the case of he was just not in his right mind. I think that as I mentioned, I think that his kind of belief in the ability of conventional munitions to deter bad people, I think that grew over the course of the decade. But I also have to say that so I think that one of the things that impresses me as I continue to kind of move gradually now into the early 1990s in my own work on the Foreign Relations series is that just how palpable and understandable the danger was with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That you have 27,000 nuclear weapons, and as Dick Cheney famously said, if 1% gets out, that's 270 nuclear weapons that aren't accounted for. And it has to have been a confidence building kind of for people like Nitze, that the more the 1990s went on and the less we actually had leakage of the Soviet arsenal, that there had to have been built confidence among people that we had fundamentally entered into a new era. Now, I can say it's miraculous that nothing got out, but it was actually very hard work on the part of multiple administrations and Americans, Kazakhs, the Kazakhstanis, and Russians and Ukrainians. The thing that I think was sort of unexpected is that just the magnitude of the AQ-Con network, and that how what we think of now as nuclear proliferation in the last 30 years is so much has been the kind of awful effects of that. But I think that I could understand Nitze very much, of Nitze of sound mind in 1999, writing what he did, believing what he did. But at the same time, I don't think we should be sort of in constrain ourselves in 2024. If we want to think about how would Nitze approach the world, I think he would probably acknowledge that the world has changed dramatically over these 25 years, and that we need to come up with the right tools to meet the new challenges.
Thank you. As we're coming to the end of our session, James, let me sort of revisit the Tom's proposition at the beginning. Students in his classes being entirely unfamiliar with Nitze. So why, if you could just put it in a nutshell at the end of this session and really rich discussion, why should students today know of Paul Nitze? What is perhaps his legacy that is with us today? It sort of jibes with a question by Hiroaki Nakanishi. What kind of lessons could be learned from a leader like Paul Nitze to solve present complex security issues?
Sure.
Okay.
So there's a fundamental thing to keep in mind here, which is that George Kennan leaves government in the early 1950, and I think is of no consequence to U.S. policies afterwards. And Paul Nitze is of extreme consequence for the 40 years that follow, because he stayed in the game. He never went home and sulked. He just got up the next morning and kept working away, chipping away at what he thought were the biggest, hardest challenges that he could conceive of, that shaped, America's future. And the point I try to make at the end of the book is that we need more people like him, and we don't need people that look like him, that sound like him. We need a more diverse set of Paul Nitzes. But at the same time, we have to kind of acknowledge that it took a toll on him, and he did have the resources to be able to go to Aspen to get away. He was hospitalized by Robert McNamara because of the stress of dealing with Robert McNamara. So I think we should be clear-eyed about just what a toll it can take. But the short answer is that we need people like him, and that doesn't make him right about everything. But again, we need more people who pursues his career as a career of patriotism and wanting the world and the country to be a better place.
Thank you. There are lots more questions in the queue. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm really grateful to you, James, as well as to Tom and Victoria for a really rich discussion. And I'll turn it over to Eric for final words. Thank you.
My thanks as well to James, Tom, Victoria, and Christian for this conversation, and for everyone who posed a question in our Q&A. Remember, we reconvene 1 week from Thursday on November 14th at 4 p.m. for a discussion of Sheila Fitzpatrick's new book, Lost Souls, Soviet Displaced Persons and the Birth of the Cold War. We hope you can join us. Till then, take care, everyone. Stay safe.